My son-in-law lifted his champagne, looked straight at me across 200 guests, and said, "Everyone, raise a glass to the woman who scrubs shopping mall floors so my wife wouldn't grow up ashamed. Don't worry. We've put down plastic in case she tracks something in." The laughter came fast and easy, the way laughter does when rich people have been waiting all night for permission. His father threw his head back. His mother pressed a napkin to her mouth like she was containing something delightful, and my daughter, my own girl, in the white dress I'd watched her dream about since she was 6, my daughter laughed too, quietly, with her eyes down. But she laughed. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I did not flinch. I'd spent 63 years learning that the face you show a room is a door, and I have always been careful about who I let walk through mine. What none of them knew, not the groom, not his preening father, not the 200 guests dabbing their eyes, was that the land their family fortune sat on, the very ground under the gleaming Hargrove Tower they bragged about all night, belonged to a numbered company in Ontario, and I was the only name on it. I want to tell you this whole story because I don't think it belongs only to me. Wherever in this country you happen to be hearing it, a warm kitchen in St. Lichen, John's with the wind off the harbor, a truck cab idling on the 401, a quiet bungalow in Kamloops with the snow coming down soft. I'd like to know where you're listening from, because every one of us has sat in some room, at some table, while people who thought they were better made us small. This is for you too. Let me take you back, though. You can't understand why my son-in-law's uncle went gray at that head table unless you understand the road I walked to get there. My husband died when our daughter was 9. He was a millwright at the pulp mill up in northern Ontario, a big, careful man who could fix anything that turned or hummed. And one February morning, his heart simply stopped on the floor of the plant before the coffee truck even came around. There was a small life insurance policy and a mortgage that suddenly had only one person to carry it. I was 34, and I had a child who still slept with the hall light on. I learned two things very quickly that winter. The first was that money, when it lands on a widow, draws people the way porch lights draw moths. My husband's own brother came around within the month, soft-voiced, full of opportunities. He had a sure thing, a partnership in a hardware franchise, and didn't I owe it to the family to keep the money working? I almost said yes. I was lonely and frightened, and he had my husband's same jaw, but something in me went still, and I told him I needed time. He stopped calling. 2 years later, that franchise folded and took 3 families' savings down with it. That was my education. I never spoke of money to anyone in my family again. The second thing I learned was that nobody was coming to save us. So I went to work. I cleaned. Office towers at first, the night shift, riding the bus downtown after I put my daughter to bed at her aunt's place and rode back before dawn so I could make her breakfast. Then a contract at a shopping mall, the one my son-in-law would later turn into a punchline. I scrubbed those floors. Yes, I know exactly what they look like at 4 in the morning when the fountains are off and your own footsteps echo. I am not ashamed of 1 minute of it. Those floors paid for skating lessons and a winter coat that fit and a set of braces so my girl could smile without covering her mouth. But here is the part people miss when they hear a story like mine, and I want to be plain about it, because I've heard the question before and it's fair. People ask, if you had money, why did you live so small? Why let your own daughter believe you were poor? I didn't let my daughter go without. She had a good childhood, a tidy house, food on the table, a paid-off piano, tuition for a teacher's college so she'd never depend on a man the way the world tried to make me depend on one. What I went without was show. There's a difference, and it's the whole difference. Because the night cleaning became a crew, and the crew became a company. I noticed, mopping those towers, which buildings were always full and which sat half empty, which landlords paid their invoices on time, and which dodged you for 90 days. I started reading the commercial real estate listings the way other people read the sports page. When a tired little strip plaza in a growing suburb came up cheap, The owner sick of it, the tenants behind. I scraped together a down payment and bought it through a numbered company so that the name on the deed was a string of digits and not a widow anybody could circle. That plaza paid for the next thing. The next thing paid for the one after. A self-storage lot. A parcel of industrial land out by the highway that everyone said was worthless until the city extended the water main and suddenly it wasn't. I never borrowed against my own name. I never moved to a bigger house. I kept driving the same Camry until the floor near rusted through, not because I was a miser, but because I had learned hard that the moment you look like prey, the wolves arrive. And I had a daughter to protect from wolves who shared our blood. I poured everything back into the next acre, the next building, the next quiet little numbered company. By the time I was 60, I owned more square footage of this province than most of the men who'd ever talked down to me, and not one of them knew it. Not even my daughter. She grew up thinking we just barely made it, and somewhere in her 20s that turned into something I didn't see clearly until it was too late. She became hungry for the thing she thought we'd never had. She started measuring people by their cars and their cottages. And when she met him, the only son of the Hargrove family, condominium developers, the kind of people whose name goes on the side of buildings, she didn't just fall in love, she climbed. I knew who his family was before she ever brought him home. I'd known the Hargrove name for years, because 3 years earlier, through one of my numbered companies, I had bought the land beneath their flagship project, a 40-story tower downtown, when their lender got nervous and quietly sold off the ground lease to clean up its books. The Hargroves didn't own the dirt their tower stood on. They paid ground rent on it every quarter to a numbered company that paid its taxes on time and never made a fuss. They had no idea who they were writing those checks to. To them, it was just an account number. So when my daughter sat at my kitchen table glowing, telling me about her wonderful Hargrove and his important family, I felt the floor tilt under me. I did not tell her what I knew. What would I have said? That I owned the ground under her future in-law's empire? She'd have thought I was lying, or losing my mind, or trying to ruin the best thing that had ever happened to her. I had spent 30 years keeping my own counsel. I kept it then too. But I want you to understand why I went to that wedding, because I've turned it over 1,000 times since. I went because I made a promise to a dying man that I would never miss a single day of our daughter's life, not the ugly ones and not the bright ones. And I went because I needed to see with my own eyes exactly what kind of people my only child was binding herself to for the rest of her life. I went knowing what was in my pocket. I went to watch. I got my answer in one toast. After he sat down to all that laughter, the dinner went on around me like nothing had happened. The plates came and went. A string quartet played. People I'd never met looked at me with a kind of amused pity. The way you'd look at a dog someone brought to a dinner party as a joke. And I sat very still and let them, the way I'd let so many rooms underestimate me, because I have always known that a quiet woman in the corner sees everything, and a loud man at the head of the table sees only his own reflection. His father stood up later and gave his own toast, all about legacy and bloodlines and the Hargrove name, about how the tower downtown was just the beginning, how the next development, a whole waterfront block, would put them on the map for good. I listened to every word. I knew that waterfront deal. I knew it was leveraged to the gunwales, that their financing was a house of cards in a windy room, that they'd missed a payment to a private lender that spring. The private lender was me. There was one man at that head table who wasn't laughing, the groom's uncle, his father's younger brother, the one who actually ran the numbers for the family firm while the others took the credit. He'd been staring at me on and off since the receiving line, his face working like a man trying to place a song he half remembered. And somewhere during his brother's speech about legacy, I watched it land. I watched the color drain out of him. Because the uncle had been in the room 8 months before, when a representative of a numbered company sat across a boardroom table and bought the note on their tower and signed the papers on the ground lease. He'd shaken that representative's hand, and now he was looking at the old woman his nephew had just called a floor scrubber, and the arithmetic was assembling itself behind his eyes, and he knew. He set his glass down very carefully and didn't touch it again all night. I drove home alone on the 401 with the radio low and the snow starting, and I did not cry. I'd done my crying decades ago in a mill town over a casket. What I felt instead was the strange, cold clarity I'd learned to trust more than any other feeling I have. They thought they'd buried me under their laughter. They had no idea they'd handed me a reason. What hurt, and I'll be honest with you, because there's no point in pretending, wasn't the men. I'd survived worse men than my son-in-law. It was the laugh. My daughter's laugh, small and downward and ashamed of me. I had carried that girl through scarlet fever in a walk-up apartment. I had worked Christmas Eve so she could have the doll. And she sat in a $4,000 dress and laughed at the woman who'd given her everything, because the people she wanted to belong to had laughed first. The months after the wedding were a slow education in what my daughter had become. I was invited to the dinners. The Hargroves liked having me there, I understood eventually, the way you keep a fool at court. I gave them a sense of their own height. At the long table in their cold, beautiful house, his mother would ask me loud, slow questions about whether I'd ever traveled anywhere, dear, anywhere at all, while his father held forth about the waterfront deal and the partners he was lining up. My son-in-law made jokes about disinfectant, and my daughter sat at the foot of the table in her new clothes and said nothing, and looked at her plate and once, just once, caught my eye and looked away so fast it was like touching a stove. People ask me why I kept going to those dinners. Same answer as the wedding, and I'll stand on it. I went because my girl was in that house, and a mother does not abandon her child to wolves just because the child has started running with them. And I went because I was watching the firm come apart from the inside, quietly, the way I watch everything, and I wanted to be in the room when the floor finally gave way under them. There is a difference between a fool and a woman pretending to be one. I have always known which I was, and the firm was coming apart. I could read it in the father's voice, in the way the bravado got louder as the foundation got softer. The waterfront partners pulled out. A second payment came late to my numbered company, then a third. The tower downtown, their pride, was bleeding money because they'd overpromised on the retail floors. The uncle started calling the numbered company's lawyer, my lawyer, with careful, sweating questions about restructuring the ground lease, about whether the holder might consider an extension, please, in light of the relationship. He didn't know the holder was the woman who came to dinner. He only knew she held the family by the throat and was being very, very patient about it. That patience was the only thing I had that they couldn't take, mock, or borrow against. I let it do its work. There was one evening, near the end, that I'll never let go of. My daughter found me in the kitchen of that big house, while the others argued in another room about money they were pretending not to have. She stood in the doorway a long time. Then she said, very low, I don't always laugh, Mom. I know you saw me at the wedding. She didn't say sorry. She wasn't ready. But she said, I don't know how I got here. And her voice cracked on the last word, and for 1 second I saw my 9-year-old in her face, the girl who slept with the hall light on. Then his mother called her name from the other room and she went, and the moment closed over like water. I held onto that crack in her armor, a mother does. I told myself there might be something left to save. The end came at their anniversary dinner, the father and mother's 35th, a great showy affair at the country club where the wedding had been. The same room, the same chandeliers. They'd invited everyone who mattered to them because the father had decided to announce that night that the waterfront deal was back on, that a new partner had stepped in, that the Hargroves were saved and triumphant. It wasn't true. It was the last great bluff of a drowning man. But he stood up in front of all those people, glass high, and told them the family was stronger than ever. I had spent the week deciding whether to do this gently or in front of everyone. I'll tell you the truth. I chose the room. Not because I'm cruel, but because they had chosen the room twice to make me small. And I have come to believe there is a kind of justice that has to be done in the same light where the wrong was done, or it isn't finished. When the father sat down to applause, I stood up. I'm not a large woman and my voice doesn't carry. The room kept buzzing, so I tapped my water glass with a fork, once the way you do, and waited. And the strange thing about a quiet woman finally standing is that a room goes still out of pure surprise. I'd like to make a correction, I said, about the waterfront and about the tower and about this family's good fortune. I looked at the father. Because there is no new partner, there's only the same one you've been avoiding all year, the holder of your ground lease, the lender on your tower. The numbered company that owns the dirt your name is bolted into. I let that sit. That company is mine. It has been mine since before your son married my daughter. I bought the ground under your empire while you were busy deciding I wasn't worth a clean fork at your table. The uncle put his face in his hands. He'd known. He just hadn't found the courage to say it out loud, and now he didn't have to. The father went the color of ash, and then of a brick, all in a few seconds. He started to bluster. Who did I think I was? This was slander. He'd have his lawyers. I let him run down. Then I told him calmly the account numbers, the dates of the missed payments, the exact figure he owed by the end of the quarter, and what would happen to the ground lease if it wasn't met, which was that the tower with his name on it would sit on land it could no longer occupy. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't need to. The numbers did all the shouting. My son-in-law, the one with the toast, the one with the jokes about disinfectant, found his voice and aimed it at me. Ugly now, no charm left. He called me a liar, and worse, in front of his parents' friends. And I watched the room watch him. And I watched the room understand, finally, which of us belonged at the head of the table. I didn't answer him. I have learned that you don't argue with a man who's drowning. You just let the water do what water does. I sat back down. I drank my own glass of water. And then I gathered my purse and I walked out before the dessert came. And I left them in that bright room with everything they'd built draining out from under them. It came apart quickly after that, the way things do once the truth is in the room and can't be put back. The waterfront deal was gone for good. No real partner would touch them once. Word got around. They sold the tower for a loss to cover the ground lease, and a developer I'd never humiliated bought it for a song. The father stopped being a man whose calls got returned. The mother, who had perfected the art of making other people feel beneath her, stopped getting the invitations she'd lived for, and a woman like that, with no audience, is just a woman alone in a cold, beautiful house. The uncle wrote me one short letter. All it said was that he'd known and stayed silent and would carry that, and I believed him, and I never answered because some debts aren't mine to forgive. My son-in-law unraveled fastest. Stripped of the money that had been his whole personality, there was nothing underneath but the temper. The marriage didn't last the year, and my daughter came to my door. It was November, and the first real snow had come, and she stood on my step in a coat that was too thin for the weather because she'd given back most of what that life had bought her. She didn't have the armor anymore. She had the face from the kitchen, the crack run all the way through now. She said she was sorry. She said it the way you say it when you mean it, which is badly, with no speech prepared. Just the word over and over and her breath fogging in the cold. I have thought a great deal about what a person owes the child who betrayed them. The people who hear this story are split, I know. Some of you will think I should have shut the door, and I understand that. There were nights I wanted to, but I am her mother. I was her mother before she was anyone's wife, and I'll be her mother after everyone else in this story is dust. I didn't gloat at her. I didn't list her sins back to her on my doorstep in the snow. I just stepped aside and let her in out of the cold, and I'd put the kettle on, because that is what my own mother did, and her mother before her, and some things are older than money. She lives near me now. It isn't what it was. You don't unlaw a laugh, and we both know it, and we work at it the slow, honest way, over years, the only way that's real. She knows now where she came from and what it cost. She knows the floors I scrubbed bought her teeth and her schooling, and the very legs she stands on. We don't talk much about the Hargroves. There's nothing left there to talk about. I never built that empire to win a war. I built it because a frightened young widow learned that the world will take everything from a woman who looks like she has nothing to lose, and I decided I would never look like that again, and I would never let my girl be poor or dependent or at the mercy of a man's family the way I'd nearly been. That the same patience also flattened the people who mocked me was not the plan. It was just what patience does, in the end, to the proud. They spend their strength performing for the room. You keep yours, quietly, in a numbered company nobody can find, and you wait, and one day the bill comes due, and you are the one holding it. So if you've ever been the joke at someone's table, the one they were sure didn't matter, let them think it. Let them laugh themselves hoarse. Keep your own counsel and keep your own ground. And when they come to you in the cold with nothing left, you'll get to decide, from a place of real strength, whether to shut the door or put the kettle on. That choice is the only revenge worth having. They invited me to that wedding to fill out the room. They called me a woman who scrubbed floors so their family wouldn't have to. And the floor they were standing on, the whole time, every one of them, was mine. The cruelty in that ballroom was never really about me, and it took me most of a winter to see it clearly. My son-in-law called me a floor scrubber in front of 200 people because he had to believe the floors meant something shameful. Because if mopping a mall at 4 in the morning made a person small, then the man who'd never worked a hard hour in his life got to feel large. That was the whole engine of it. Pride that has nothing underneath it has to keep finding people to stand on. And a family that builds its name on standing on others will sooner or later run out of ground. They ran out of mine. Nothing that happened to the Hargroves came from luck, and nothing that came to me did either. They missed their payments because they spent on show instead of substance. Their partners walked because a man who lies at the head of a table eventually lies in a boardroom too. My son-in-law's marriage fell apart because charm with no character behind it is a coat you can only wear in good weather. Every door that closed on them, they had built the hinge for years before. That's not a curse anyone put on them. That's just what choices do when you give them enough time to grow up. What kept me standing wasn't money. Money was only the proof. What kept me standing was that I'd learned, the hard way, to think 3 moves past the room I was sitting in, to read the listings, watch the checks, notice which buildings filled and which emptied, while everyone assumed the quiet woman in the corner saw nothing. And underneath that, plain and stubborn, was the refusal to fold. A frightened young widow with a 9-year-old and a Milltown mortgage decided she would not be prey, and she got up before dawn for 30 years to make it true. None of that is glamorous. It's just grit kept up long after anyone's watching. But the part I'm proudest of isn't the numbered company or the ground lease. It's the kettle. When my daughter, my Claire, came up my steps in November in a coat too thin for the snow, with no speech and the word sorry coming out of her badly, I had every right to shut the door. I didn't, and not because I'd forgotten the laugh. I'll never forget the laugh. I let her in because being right is worth less than being decent, and because I would rather be the kind of person who opens the door than the kind who finally gets to slam one. So build something no one can take. Yes. Be sharp enough to see the bill coming before the proud ever do. But save your softness for the people who come back in the cold. That's the only ending that lets you sleep.